All right, let's get right into it. About a decade ago, China launched what was supposed to be the project of the century, the Belt and Road Initiative. It was one of the most ambitious things the world had ever seen. But fast forward to today, and you hear a very different story. People are calling it a geopolitical disaster. So what's the real story? That's what we're digging into today.
This quote from our source material really just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the whiplash. The vision was so grand, but for so many countries that signed up, the reality turned out to be a total nightmare. So how on earth did we get from that grand promise to this?
To really get what went so wrong, we've got to rewind the clock. Let's go back to 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, was unveiled to the world with a ton of fanfare.
And the scale, just look at this number. It was absolutely staggering. Our sources estimate that China poured somewhere around $1.2 trillion into this thing. To even try and wrap your head around that, that's more money than the entire yearly economic output of most countries on the planet.
And we're not talking about a small, exclusive club here. Over 150 countries. That's a huge chunk of the world either officially signed on or were lining up to be part of this vision. You can see why the appeal was so massive.
So what was China selling exactly? Well, the official pitch was a modern-day Silk Road. It was supposed to be a win-win for everybody. The idea was to build this incredible web of new ports, highways, and railways connecting 3 continents. It was meant to lift up poorer nations and, of course, cement China's place as a true global leader. It was a vision of shared prosperity.
But as our source material lays out, the reality on the ground started to paint a much darker picture. And there is no better place to start than with the project that became the poster child for everything wrong with the BRI, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka.
And the story of this port, it unfolds just like a slow-motion car crash. Sri Lanka takes out this enormous loan to build a port that many experts said wasn't even needed. Sure enough, by 2016, it was a ghost town, barely seeing any ships. And the final punchline? It was devastating. Unable to pay back the mountain of debt, Sri Lanka had to hand over control of its own strategic port to a Chinese company for the next 99 years. Many saw this as a shocking loss of sovereignty.
And here's the thing. The story doesn't end in Sri Lanka. According to our sources, this wasn't just a one-off mistake. It was the start of a pattern, one that would pop up all over the world and lead to some very serious accusations.
And this is where we get to this really critical term, debt trap diplomacy. The accusation, right, is that this was all by design. The idea is that China would offer these massive loans that they knew poorer countries could never pay back. Then, when they inevitably defaulted, China could swoop in and take control of their most valuable assets, like ports or mines.
Now, if you want a perfect picture of why people got so worried, just look at this slide. This is the Gwadar port in Pakistan, another massive BRI project. The deal they signed gives the Chinese operator 91% of the revenue. 91! Pakistan gets just 9%. Just imagine taking on all that debt for a project where you barely see any of the profits. You can see why that caused an uproar.
And the list of these so-called problem projects just keeps going. Zambia went into default with a huge chunk of its debt owed to China. Montenegro spent $1 billion on a tiny piece of a road to nowhere that crippled its economy. In Ecuador, a brand new dam is literally cracking apart. Oh, and that airport they built in Sri Lanka? It's now nicknamed the world's emptiest airport. It's just a trail of disasters.
Which brings us to another great term for all of this, the white elephant. You know, these huge, expensive projects that look impressive but are basically useless and just drain money? That highway in Montenegro? A total white elephant. The world's emptiest airport? The definition of a white elephant.
So you can imagine, this string of disasters didn't go unnoticed. The world started paying very close attention, and the geopolitical fallout was huge. Other global powers started to react.
And then came a moment that was just a massive PR disaster for the BRI. Italy, the only major Western economy, the only G7 nation to sign up, publicly backed out. And they didn't just quietly leave, they flat out said joining was a big mistake. That was a huge blow to the project's credibility and a sign that the tide was really turning.
So what happens when there's a vacuum? Competitors rush in. The US and the EU saw an opening and launched their own big infrastructure plans. And as you can see, they're marketing themselves as the exact opposite of the BRI. They're promising transparency, fair loan terms, and private investment. All the things critics said China's projects were missing. A new global power game was officially on.
But there was another huge geopolitical shift happening here, maybe one that wasn't intended.
As Russia became more and more isolated from the West, it leaned harder on China and the BRI. Our sources argue this has helped create a new kind of axis, a bloc of powerful nations pushing back against American influence on the world stage.
Okay, so all of this begs the billion-dollar, or I guess trillion-dollar question. If the BRI wasn't really about helping other countries, what was the real game plan here all along?
While the sources we're looking at point to a pretty clear set of motives, and spoiler alert, it was all about China's own self-interest. It was a brilliant way to send their extra steel, concrete, and construction crews overseas to work on these projects. It was about locking down access to raw materials for their own factories, expanding their global influence, and yes, gaining control over strategic ports around the world. It was a China-first strategy, plain and simple.
So after a decade of terrible headlines and accusations of debt traps, the Belt and Road brand is, to put it mildly, in trouble.
So what do you do when your brand is damaged? You rebrand.
And that's exactly what China seems to be doing. Meet BRI 2.0. It's a big pivot. The new focus is moving away from those gigantic debt-fueled megaprojects. The new buzzwords are smaller and greener. They're talking about digital infrastructure, green energy, and projects that are actually, sustainable and make economic sense. It's a full-on rebranding effort.
Which leaves us right here with the big unanswered question. China may have spent $1 trillion to expand its influence, but instead it got stuck with the toxic label of debt-trap diplomacy. Now they're trying to change course. But can this new BRI 2.0 actually fix the project's reputation, or has the world already made up its mind? Is the damage already done?